Last November, as I and my family had just arrived here in Santa Barbara, a few months earlier, I did not schedule the typical fall stewardship campaign. And what that means is that this is the first Sunday I will be making an invitation with you all to turn in estimated giving cards to invite you to share what you are planning to do as far as supporting our mission and ministry program here at Santa Barbara First in the coming year. Now, some of you got your mail and got those commitment cards. Some of you did not, but Suzanne has some in the back if you want to do that. But as you think about this sermon, you may want to spend the week and bring them next week or send them in during the week, and I invite you to do that. As I was preparing for this Sunday, I thought of how it wasn't much more than 20 years ago that one of your dearly beloved pastors retired, the Reverend Lloyd Saintgen, and then how over the last 19 years you've all had to get used to different ministers like Pastor Hillary and Pastor Allen and Pastor Mark and Pastor Liz. And I thought that about how pastoral changes can be difficult with just me coming just a little over a year ago. And I just want to say how much we valued the expressions of welcome that you have shared with us, your gracious words of affirmation and encouragement as we waited to get into our parsonage and just, all sorts of things. But I also reflected how over the past 3 weeks we've been exploring the teachings of John Wesley that seem surprisingly current, even though they come from a sermon that he preached several times more than 250 years ago. And I was particularly thinking about something that I cited last week in the sermon. And this was published in 1829, this book. And he says this: money is an excellent gift of God, answering the noblest ends. In the hands of God's children, it is food for the hungry, drink for the thirsty, clothing for the naked. It gives to the traveler and the stranger where to lay his head. By it we may supply the place of a husband to a widow and of a father to the fatherless. We may be a defense to the oppressed, a means of health to the sick, of ease to them that are in pain. It may be as eyes to the blind, as feet to the lame, yes, even a lifter up from the gates of death. Now, I've been in ministry long enough to know that people in the church might ask, really? Is that what our giving is doing? Or is it really just paying the utility bills, or staff salaries, or Sunday school curriculum? And as Jesus so often did when he was confronted by questions like these, I would like to tell you a story. And like all good stories, it begins with once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a child who grew up attending Sunday worship every week. The child came to love and even memorize most of the biblical stories that were shared in Sunday school. The child loved when there were communion elements on the communion table on the first Sunday of the month. Loved to sing in the children's choir. Loved potluck dinners, especially the deviled eggs. And when those folks would bring a bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. The child especially loved summer camp, where God's love was made real through the adult counselors and the other campers. Well, throughout this child's life, there were also challenges and traumas. At 3 years old, this child's 12-year-old brother died. At 5, the child's mother disappeared from the family. The next time the child heard about the mother was at 12 years old, the news that she had died. And by the time that his father had remarried and divorced and remarried, the child was 13 years old and was pretty much done with church. The child's father began to focus on his new blended family, which included 3 step-siblings in the home and 2 step-siblings out of the home. And this 13-year-old child, felt sort of out of place. Muddling through well enough, this child got, halfway decent grades and made it to young adulthood with a fairly good moral compass intact. And he earned money by throwing newspapers and mowing lawns because he didn't want to be a burden on his dad's family. But along that road of the teenage years, some pretty dark things occurred in this child's life. But then at 18, his father was diagnosed with terminal cancer. The doctors told him to just go home and wrap up his affairs. Well, his dad had been far from perfect. He'd been tender and loving, one of those rare fathers who made sure to give hugs and say, "I love you." So this terminal diagnosis was a real blow. And over despair, over his father's impending death, this young adult began to party with his friends. Whatever it took at the time to cover the pain of a broken and still breaking heart. I think the gory details are unnecessary, but it is a simple fact that it is only by God's grace that I eventually became a deputy probation officer instead of ending up a client on a probation officer's caseload. And I'm not exaggerating. What was the nature of that grace? I remember it really well. It was a Sunday morning, and I woke up at a friend's house after what had become a fairly typical Friday and Saturday weekend of partying. And I realized that there would be a worship service at my home church in a couple of hours. And even though I did not have a car with me, I slipped out of the house and I walked to that church that I'd grown up attending. It was a 7-mile walk. That same church where I had first heard God's call to ministry and fled. Was the church with the potlucks, the children's choir, the communion elements on the communion table, the church that so often helped to pay my way to church camp. And what mattered on that Sunday morning was nothing that the preacher said during his 40-minute sermon. And those of you who attended St. Mark knew that Pastor Lee always preached 40-minute sermons. What did matter is that the church I had grown up attending was there to walk into on that Sunday morning. The electricity was on. The Sunday school teachers that I had learned from were still there. The preacher, the organist, the choir director were all there, as was the cross I had grown up gazing upon. And I felt like the prodigal who had returned home. And all I received on that Sunday morning, like the prodigal son, was the same warm embrace of those people who had been there that whole time when I was not. So even without the gory details, you now know that you have a pastor with a past. Amen. This was the stole my home church gave me when I was ordained in the United Methodist Church. Psalm 23 was one of the first passages, like many of you, that I memorized as a child in Sunday school. And I loved and I believed in verse 6 when I'd say it, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And yet, like me, don't all of us know times when goodness and mercy seem absent from our lives? Wondering, where in the world is goodness and mercy anywhere in this brutal world? I certainly felt that way as I was a teenager and young adult. Goodness and mercy seemed to take a break from following me anywhere. Well, I now have a seminary education. And I know that the Hebrew word that we translate as follow in verse 6 can also be translated as pursue. And that's an important thing to know. Meaning that even when we feel the absence of God's presence and goodness and mercy, in the same way that I did for a few years, the psalmist affirms that God's goodness and mercy are still trying to run us down, chasing after us even when it is we who are going in the wrong direction. Amen? A couple years from now, in 2027, the sanctuary will be 100 years old. The church, of course, in Santa Barbara is quite a bit older. It's existed in a couple of different locations. But I happen to believe that this church was established by people who were farsighted enough to know that there'd be children like me who'd need this church, as I needed my home church, for their pilgrimages of faith, no matter how dark the valleys they traversed. This church, like so many others, was established as a beacon, a reminder that God is ever pursuing us with goodness and mercy, even when we are going the other direction. And so I give thanks for the saints who, for well over 100 years, have given their offerings to this church to make sure that the electricity is on, the doors are open, the staff are here, and that the Sunday school curriculum is paid for. A church that would send so many children to summer camp or to Sierra Service Project. So as you offer your estimate of giving card today or sometime during this week, I can tell you from direct experience that yes, your gifts to support this church's ministry and mission, like my home church, are a lifter up from the gates of death and despair. There were some pretty hairy times in my teenage and young adult years. Much hairier than anything I encountered as a probation officer. And so you really never know what will become of a prodigal who has been chased down by God's amazing grace and unconditional love. That prodigal might just end up being your pastor. Amen.